Everybody is there. Yes, I see the candidate. Welcome to this session, very important for you. I hereby open this academic ceremony in which Maksim Pleshkov will defend the academic thesis, Fundamental Studies to Assess and Restore Vestibular Function in Patients with Severe Bilateral Vestibular Loss. May I invite you to present a summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis.
Thank you, dear Prorector. Now I'm going to share my screen and show you the presentation. So, dear Prorector, dear members of the Corona, dear family, friends, and the audience, in the next 15 minutes, I'm going to present you the results of my research. But first of all, let us discuss what is the vestibular system itself. So, the vestibular system is a tiny balance organ, which is together with the cochlea, which is a hearing organ, forms the inner ear located in the left and right temporal bones. So the vestibular system consists of 3 semicircular canals that detect rotations of the head in 3 dimensions, and 2 otolith organs that detect gravity and translations also in 3 dimensions. The vestibular system facilitates several functions, among which are the balance control, spatial orientation. It also helps us to feel or perceive self-motion, and it helps us to stabilize the image during the head movement. Yeah, but what happens if we lose vestibular function on both sides, left and right? So this condition is called the bilateral vistibulopathy. It means almost no function in both vestibular organs. It leads to a number of symptoms like imbalance, dizziness, vertigo, and oscillopsia. So the example of oscillopsia is shown on the video. So it is the feeling like the surrounding world is shaking. It is similar to the situation when the camera on your mobile phone has no stabilization at all. It also leads to the reduced quality of life of such patients. It leads to an extra economical burden for the society. And unfortunately, treatment options are limited at current. But recently, a novel method to restore the absent vestibular function was introduced. It is called the vestibular implant. And my research was pretty much focused around the vestibular implant. So my research contains 4 main research topics. So first of all, we tried to make the vestibular diagnostics more affordable. Then we investigated self-motion perception. After that, we investigated the flow of the electrical current produced by the vestibular implant inside of the inner ear. And finally, we characterized patients who are eligible to get the vestibular implant. So let us discuss them one by one. The first question is, how do we test vestibular function? So there is a such called vestibular ocular reflex that connects the vestibular system with the eyes. It is a fast reflex by which the vestibular system controls our eyes. So for example, when our head is turned to either side, the vestibular ocular reflex makes our eyes to turn to the opposite side. If the vestibular function and the vestibular ocular reflex are intact, the eye velocity is exactly equal to the head velocity, but with the opposite direction. And actually, we can use this fact to test the vestibular function. Among the commonly used tests, there is one that is called the head impulse test. During the head impulse test, the examiner abruptly turns the subject's head to one of the sides, and meanwhile observes the eye movements. So if the vestibular function is intact, the tested subject is able to keep the eyes on the target. So the subject continues to look at us. But in the situation when the vestibular ocular reflex is impaired, like in this subject when his head is turned to the right, you can see that his eyes lose the target. But it's not really convenient to compare the head and eye velocities just by the naked eye. Therefore, we can use one of the existing oculography methods. And there are 2 oculography methods that are commonly used in clinics. They are video oculography and electrooculography. So video oculography normally consists of the VOG goggles that are mounted on the subject's head with the built-in video camera that records the movement of the eye. Whereas the electrooculography consists of the amplifier and the electrodes that are attached just around the eye and detect electrical field produced by the eye during the eye movements. So video oculography is a modern and rather expensive technique, whereas electrooculography is older and less expensive. And so far, it was unknown if the electrooculography can be applied to perform the head impulse test. So therefore, we compared the eye velocities simultaneously recorded by both oculography systems, video oculography and electrooculography. And we found out that the eye velocities recorded by video oculography in yellow traces here and recorded by the electrooculography in black traces come really close to each other, and there is not so much difference between these two systems, which means that electrooculography can serve as an alternative or can be used complementary to video oculography to perform the head impulse test and therefore make the vestibular diagnostics more affordable. But what about motion perception? This is also one of the functions that is facilitated by vestibular system. So historically, the vestibular function was diagnosed based on the vestibular reflexes, but we can also try to measure the self-motion perception. So the self-motion perception can be quantified by measuring the threshold, which is the minimum perceived acceleration by the subject. It can be measured by the setup you can see on the video. This is the motion platform that can perform 12 different movements, like in 3 dimensions, 6 rotations and 6 translations. The tested subject is seated on the platform in a dark room and is not aware about the movement. So once the movement is presented to the subject has to respond the direction and the type of movement. And then step by step, we start to make the platform movement slower and slower until we reach the threshold. So the problem with the self-motion perception is that in the research setting, it takes several hours to identify the thresholds of all 12 different movements, which is inconvenient for the patient and is barely applicable in clinic. So what we have done, we have developed a relatively fast procedure that can measure all 12 motion thresholds in, say, less than 1 hour. Moreover, we compared different methods to measure the threshold. So the red bars indicate the method where the subject has to choose from all 12 possible movements. It means that the subject has to indicate the direction and the type of the movement, and another approach where the subject has to choose only from 2 options. For example, I'm moving left or right. And the graphs indicate the thresholds obtained by these 2 methods. And we can see that the results, the red and the blue bars, they significantly differ, which means we need to collect the normative data for each paradigm we use. On top of that, the thresholds were measured in a group of patients having bilateral vistibulopathy, which are indicated with the orange bars on the graph. And their results were compared with the healthy controls, shown with the green bars. And again, we can see that patients having bilateral vistibulopathy show on significantly higher thresholds of self-motion perception. So these facts allow us to add the self-motion perception testing to already existing test battery of the vestibular function, which is based on the vestibular reflexes. So, and what about treatment? So nearly a decade ago, the device, which is called the vestibular implant, was firstly introduced in humans. So the vestibular implant is an artificial balance organ that aims to restore the vestibular function. So it consists of the motion sensor that detects the head movements. Then the information is processed and is sent via the electrodes directly via the nerves to the brain by means of the electrical current. So the electrodes of the vestibular implant are inserted inside of the inner ear. You can see the electrodes as the spheres. And let us imagine the situation that we want to stimulate only this lower canal. And the question rises that how and where will the electrical current propagate inside of the inner ear? And maybe we can find the best location of the electrodes to improve the electrical stimulation. It's pretty difficult to perform experiments in humans. That's why we performed measurements in laboratory animals. So we measure the electrical properties of the inner ear in guinea pig. And based on this knowledge, we have constructed a three-dimensional model of electrical conductivity. So this constructed model allows us to simulate the voltage and the current propagation in the inner ear. So the voltage here is shown in color, where higher voltage is shown in red, and the low voltage is shown in blue. As you all know, that the electrical current will propagate from the positive pole, plus here, to the negative, and the minus. And the current will flow throughout the whole inner ear. But this situation is not exactly what we wanted. We wanted to stimulate only this canal. What we can do using the model, we can move the electrodes closer to each other. So, for example, moving the positive pole down. And in this situation, we can see that the current localization occurs only in the target region. So which means our model is able to predict the best electrode locations. And the final question is, each bilateral vestibulopathy patient eligible for vestibular implantation? In order to answer this question, we have studied a group of bilateral vestibulopathy patients, and we found out that only 76% of them are eligible to get the vestibular implant. Which means like their symptoms are not always equal to the outcomes of laboratory testing. And it also means that before any patient can get the vestibular implant, the vestibular function of such patients should be thoroughly studied on both sides, and every end organ also should be studied thoroughly. So to sum up, the results of my research are as following. So we have shown that the electroculography can potentially be applied to perform head impulse tests in order to make the vestibular diagnostics more affordable. Then we learned that motion perception depends on how do we test it, which means we need the normative data for each testing approach. Also, the bilateral vestibulopathy reduced motion perception and resulted in higher thresholds, which means we can try to apply the self-motion perception testing for diagnostics of the vestibular function. Then we have constructed the electrophysiological model of the inner ear, which can be used in the future to predict the better electrical stimulation by the vestibular implant. And finally, we found out that only 76% of patients suffering from bilateral vestibulopathy are eligible to get the vestibular implant, which means we need to thoroughly study the vestibular function of such patients before vestibular implantation. Thank you for your attention. Now I will give the floor back to the prorector.
Thank you very much for this very clear overview of your thesis and the results you obtained. Now it's time to start with the opposition, and the opposition will be opened by Professor Wouts. Professor Wouts is a professor of physics at the University of Antwerp and the European Institute for ENT St. Augustinus, also in Antwerp. Professor Wouts, the floor is yours.
Dear Madam Prorector, thank you. Dear candidates, I was very much pleased as a physicist to read your thesis where you approached the intrinsic vestibular system with tools of physics, and obviously I like that very much. In particularly, for instance, the fact that you you dared to compare EOG with VOG, the video with electroochrography, which is old, dated, but I think it's still very reliable. Now, my question there is the following. Back in the old days, when I was very much inspired by the work of Professor Herman Kingma, and I'm talking about the 90s and early 2000s, we were experimenting with byte boards, because the whole question is, if you measure the head velocity, then it is very important to know what is the head velocity. And the intrinsic problems with VOG, with the V-hit, is slippage. Now, you are using the accelerometer of the video system to compare or to analyze together with the EOG system. What would be the improvement if you would also introduce again a sort of like a byte board to be sure that you have no slippage?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your question. Indeed, there is a problem related with the Google slippage, which is related with nearly all video hidden post-test systems based on the goggles. Also, the manufacturers recommend, they actually provide a number of recommendations how to overcome this issue, and one of them is, of course, well-known, tightening the strap which holds the goggles. And apparently, if this type of videochlography devices is widely used in clinics, this partly or more than enough solves the problem. In the research settings, when we stick to the precision of our measurements, indeed, it would be nice to use the byte boards. And in the future, I believe it would, of course, in this study, we have relied our measurements on the gyroscopes and accelerometers, which are built in the videochlography. But in the future, if we aim to develop a standalone electroochrography-based device, of course, we need to introduce the measurement of head velocity one way or another. And to my opinion, the first step, of course, would be to use the byte board. And in this condition, we can also compare the byte board measurement and the measurement of the gyroscopes built in the videochlography to check how much slippage do we get during the measurement. Absolutely. That's
a very good answer. Thank you. In the same approach, I was wondering, you were measuring the thresholds for the yaw translation or rotations and the pitch rotations. And you found that the yaw threshold is higher. And then you said, okay, because we feel that we are kind of like bending over, so we have this gravity input, which is also giving more information to our brain. Now, would it be possible to lie down the subject on this platform and then make a rotation? So then you, and then make a roll, which would mean that you induce again a yaw stimulation for the horizontal canals. Do you think you would have then lower thresholds for the horizontal canal compared to the vertical canals? Because the vector of gravity is then 90 degrees tilted.
As highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your question. That is an interesting suggestion. Yeah, of course, the pitch and the roll are really difficult movements to study because of the action of the gravity. But also during our threshold measurements, we cannot completely exclude other somatosensory systems. Yeah, we can deny the vision by switching off the light. We can deny the hearing by wearing the headphones that mask the sounds on the platform. But it is really difficult to switch off the proprioception, for example, and the gravity. If we change the vector of gravity acting on the vestibular system, there still will be the limbs of the body that potentially can feel the movement. Of course, yeah, probably, I think when we change the body position on the platform, it will probably give us different results of the thresholds we measure.
Okay, what I also appreciate is that you once more stress the fact that each lab should establish their own normative data. And that's very important, and that's what you do as a physicist, establish own normative data. A physical question, rather regarding also, again, the sensitivity for the canals, vertical versus horizontal. Do you think it would imply that the gains for the vestibular implant would then also be different electrically because of these different thresholds?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your question. Yes, probably we will need to adjust the electrical stimulation for each separate canal. So probably the sensitivity of the horizontal canal is a bit higher than the vertical canals because we used to make the head rotations in a horizontal plane. Yeah, it would be nice actually to perform such type of an experiment, but what the problem we face normally with the vestibular implant is also related to the electrode position, and you never know how much current is delivered directly to the target nerve. If we could create, let's say, a perfect situation when we know for sure that we can deliver the same amount of current to the same canal, it would be interesting to compare.
Okay, fine. And then my final question is actually also a bit on the current spread and the impact of the position of the electrodes. And then the next step is also, what is your opinion about the two different vestibular implant approaches? You have the canal approach, where the three semicircular canals are being stimulated, and there are other groups who are stimulating the otolith system. Well, given this difference in and these complications regarding current spread and stimulating the appropriate part of the vestibular system, how can you elaborate on this difference between otolith stimulation versus the canal stimulation as an effect for the patient having bilateral loss?
Yeah, highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your question. I would start actually with the functions of the otolith. Unlike the function of the semicircular canals, the otolith function is not so very well studied, and we still need to do a lot of research to understand how does the otolith organ provide information to our brain. So this is one of the fundamental drawbacks with the otolith implant again. Because we have less knowledge about the otoliths than about the semicircular canals. The second drawback is that the otoliths are, let's say, are two-dimensional structures with a sensory epithelium spread all over some area, and probably we need to develop, more specific electrodes to stimulate one part of the otoliths or another. Given the fact that both otoliths and the semicircular canals are stimulated normally from the inside of the inner ear, which is filled with the liquid, it makes the situation bad for both stimulation of canals and the otoliths. For the canals, there are some solutions introduced by different research groups. For example, by introducing the bipolar electrodes, as I have shown in my slides, where we localize the current flow in only one specific area, or even putting the ground electrode somewhere in the common cross, unlike the situation which is implemented now, where the ground is located in the temporal bone. So probably similar approaches can help also in the otolith stimulation. But to my opinion, the enthusiasts who are dealing with the otolith implant are doing a really great job, but their job is very difficult.
Thank you. Madam Prorector, these were my questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Ruijs, for your contribution to this PhD defense. Then we move to the next opponent, that is Professor van Bentum. Professor van Bentum is Professor of ENT Surgery at Leiden University Medical Center. Professor van Bentum.
Thank you very much, Madam Prorector. Dear candidate, first of all, I would like to congratulate you on this fine body of work. It is adding knowledge in this particular field is very relevant, and I would also therefore congratulate your supervisors, Professor Kingma, Dr. van den Berg, and Professor Demke. Very nice. But also still there are some questions to be asked, and as I'm a doctor and you are a physicist, I would like to try to get these both worlds mixed up a bit, and well, we'll see where it ends. I would like to discuss chapter 2 with you to start out with, and as you've also pointed out in your presentation, you say that of all BV patients, about 76% are suitable for implantation. But in chapter 2, you try to establish a new normative values for measurements like caloric testing, V-hit, and torsion swing test. And these tests and their outcomes are part of criteria for suitability for implantation. So my question is, what happens when you use these new normative values? What happens to the 76%? I mean, did you later on validate the normative values in relation to the suitability for implantation? Well, could you explore? Could you elaborate a bit on that, please?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your question. Indeed, we tried to investigate the group of patients with bilateral vistibulopathy and to see how many of them are actually able to get the vestibular implant based on the criteria introduced already in the literature. So the criteria to get the vestibular implant are a little bit more strict, probably because the doctors, the authors of the article who created this criteria, wanted to make sure that if you perform the implantation, you make only the benefit and you don't make the situation even worse, because the implantation brings some risks, yeah, to the patient, especially when you damage the membranous labyrinth and the two liquids mix with each other. In our study, we actually stick only to the results of the vestibular tests, like caloric tests, torsion swing, and V-hit. But apart from that, the criteria for the vestibular implantation include several more items to be fulfilled, among which are the comorbidities that the patient has, ability to undergo the surgery, which means like that our estimation of 76% can be even an overestimation. So in the reality, when we start to pick the patients for the surgery, this number will be even lower. One of the problems that we faced during the research, that the data gathered from different centers and cannot really be pulled together, because one center uses one device, other center uses another device. So, which also brings us to the problem of kind of standardization of measurements, because when we look at the criteria, they don't really specify the way how should you obtain the number, for example, for the gain.
So the percentage, I'm sorry to interrupt you, if I may, Madam Co-Rector. So, but you point out that, as I say, that the testing is part of the workup for patients, whether or not they're suitable for implantation. Secondly, you tell me that the normative values per center differ. I read that. So my question is, how do how do these normative value changes influence the percentage of BV patients suitable for implantation? So in one center, for instance, you have 80% in same population after measurements. In the other center, you have 60%. I don't know. Could you say something about that?
To be honest, I cannot tell you the numbers, like in the percent at the moment. But since the approaches are relatively the same, so we should also get the relatively the same numbers. And if each center collects its own normative data, then the cutoff value for having the implant should also be probably developed based on the knowledge obtained in this center.
Okay, thank you. Next question about chapter 2, that you've described etiologically several afflictions like trauma, neurodegenerative and genetic disorders, and also Meniere's disease and infectious disorders. And what you see is a difference in the way the vestibular system is touched by these diseases. So, but what you also say is, what you have pointed out in figure 2.3 in that chapter is that for on average, all diseases, if I understand correctly, the anterior superior canal is least affected. Do you have an explanation for that?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your question. So the anterior canal sparing has been already found in the literature, in the previous literature, and it was related to the certain disease, certain etiology types. So probably it could also be in our study that these etiologies are prevailing in our study cohort. But in general, I think there is no clear explanation for this fact yet. Probably we need to gather more data, especially because in our study that we performed, some etiology groups contained a really small amount of patients, like less than 5 or even 1 patient. And our sample can be to some extent not representative. So I really hope that gathering more data from different testing centers will help us to understand the picture in general.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your answer. It's still in the dark then. We'll have to accept that. I would like to, my last question is about proposition number 1. Not every patient diagnosed with bilateral vistibulopathy is eligible for vestibular implantation, since it requires examination of all 5 vestibular end organs to ensure the implantation benefit. So at present, do you think that we have a proper workup? Do you think that we have an estimation of the function of all 5 end organs in a proper way? What do you propose that we do research on in the future to get that picture, to get a better picture?
Yeah, thank you, highly esteemed opponent. Thank you for your question. I think the situation we have at current is good, because when the patient comes to the diagnostic center for the first time, normally he or she gets a golden standard testing with the calorics or the video head impulse test, which makes the first selection. We can to understand how much residual function does the patient have. And if we classify the patient as a bilateral vistibulopathy, and we have a thought in our mind that this patient can be eligible for the implant, we can send him or her for the for an extra testing to check all other end organs, because maybe this patient does not need to undergo the whole battery of all tests we have at the moment, because from one side it is a burden for the patient, from another side it's a burden for the clinic, and also from the economical side. So.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam Prorector. This is my contribution to the opposition. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your contribution, Professor van Bentum. The opposition will now be continued by Professor Peters. Professor Peters is Professor of Mathematics in Knowledge Engineering at Maastricht University. Professor Peters.
Thank you, Madam Prorector. And dear candidates, also let me congratulate you first with a very nice thesis. And I would like to extend my compliments also to the supervisory team. I think it was very enjoyable to read and also very readable, so very well written. Of course, with so many chapters, there's also quite a few questions to ask. And I would like to focus first on chapter 3. In chapter 3, there's let's say, investigations into the EUG and the VUG based on data from 19 healthy subjects. And I was curious, why would you only include healthy subjects in your data set? Because you plan to use it on patients. Can you say a bit more about that?
Yes, highly esteemed opponent, thank you for the question. The answer for this question is quite simple. We performed the measurements and here in Tomsk in Russia, but unfortunately in our area, it's rather difficult to find the patients having the vestibular deficits. That's why we made only the first step and have tested the feasibility of the application. Of course, we had the pre-feeling, let's say, in our minds that it will work, but we wanted to make sure that we, at least in healthy subjects, we can see that electroocculography can perform as good as the video occulography. And of course, for the future, we wanted to cooperate with Maastricht University, who have a really big group of patients suffering from the vestibular vistibulopathy to extend our study.
Okay, yeah, that's clear. Now I understand that better. And maybe in the same spirit, I noticed that in chapter 3, I think your conclusions stay very close to what you indeed investigated. But when I read the general introduction and I move to page 15, where you introduce chapter 3, you also make suggestions that this will help you to work with vertical head and pulse testing, while you only test it on horizontal. And you can use it in infants and maybe in other situations where you cannot fit goggles. So you agree with me that that is a bit stretching it at this point?
Yes, highly esteemed opponent. Thank you for your comment. Yeah, indeed. Maybe just there was some error in writing the chapter 3, and when preparing the outline of the thesis, I added the thoughts that came to my mind a little bit later. But these ideas come from the fundamental physical differences between the electroocculography and video occulography. So when we try to perform the vertical head impulse test, the limitation is that we need to turn the subject's head 45 degrees left or right, and then the vertical movement of the eye is very much limited by the eyelids from the bottom. Whereas, yeah, electroocculography is not susceptible for this limitation. So that's why it would be interesting also in the future to check how it works.
Yeah, I agree with that. So then I would like to move to chapter 7, maybe chapter 8 in the same spirit, where you investigated a model that you then tried to fit using data. And now that's a topic that interests me very much from my own background. So, and I was wondering, because there was not so much I could learn about the exact method that you use. You write something that you use a custom-made method and you implemented that in MATLAB. That's about it. So could you say a bit more on the optimization or the parameter fitting method that you used? It was least squares based, I know. That's about it.
Yes, highly esteemed opponent. Thank you for your question. Yes, indeed, there was the non-linear least squares that we used to bring the data simulations and the experimental data.
Okay, and that's the one that is built in MATLAB itself.
Yes. Exactly.
Okay, so it's not that much custom made. So it's just employing these built-in functions. Okay.
Yeah, it was a custom-made script based on the built-in functions.
Okay, then I know which ones to expect, because some of these methods may be global optimization while others find local optima. And I was wondering if that happened in your case, because if you look at the very first fit, I think it's a table on page 119. Let me try and get that here. 119, you see the initial values for your search. And then on the next page 121, you find the optimal values when you just fitted, I think, just a saline solution, those data. And one of the parameters never moved. So there's a 0.06 that you start with and that you remain with. So I'm just wondering what is happening there. And did you look into that? Because all the other parameters move quite a bit.
Very esteemed opponent, thank you for your question. Yeah, indeed. So probably the methods we have used to fit the curve would find the local minimum. And we tried to adjust a little bit the results we get by setting the upper and lower limits. And we have also performed a number of fittings which started with different start points. And the majority of them, they have actually, they gave us the fit these values. So regarding the value of 0.06, unfortunately, I don't have the text of my thesis next to me. Could you please maybe tell me what kind of parameter was that?
Yeah, it's the parameter A for the EDL that you are working the electrical double layer capacitance. Now that was C, but A is the inverse magnitude of the Warburg element impedance. But it just doesn't move. So, well, you don't have the data, so obviously you can't just probe the data right now. But maybe that could help explain the quality of the fits, because I was looking at figure 7.5, where you have a number of graphs that you fitted. And it looks like they all have some shortcomings, in my opinion. There's an occasional outlier in the data that you may want to discard if you're not going to use it. But also some of the shapes, well, the rough shape is captured, but I guess the model would automatically do that. And for the rest, I'm not sure if you must be very happy with these fits. And then just to link to that straight away, in chapter 8, you have another picture with a similar fit, that's on page 136, where part of the data fits much better, but then an initial part of phases doesn't fit at all. So that would be something for me to look further into. So what's your opinion on that? Is there room for improvement?
Yeah, highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your question. So maybe first I can comment on the parameters that belong to the Warburg element. So the parameter, there were two fits. First of all, we fitted the measurements in the saline solution, and afterwards we fitted the data for the guinea pig inner ear. So the original idea was to identify the parameters of the electrical double layer in the saline solution only, and then afterwards we assumed that the electrical double layer remained the same in the guinea pig because there is a metal electrode and the liquid contact. So that's why we kept the same values for the electrical double layer also in the guinea pig model. It was done by the intention. So regarding the quality of model fit, yes, of course, there is a room for the improvement, but as you may probably know that there can be also a problem of overfitting. So we stick to this not ideal, not perfect fit, because the model we constructed, both the model of the equivalent circuit and the two-dimensional model, is easy to explain. So we know the physical processes occurring there, and these physical processes give us the result we got. Of course, especially in the case of the equivalent circuit model, we could add much more elements in it, like 10, 20, 30, and most probably fit would improve. But the question rises afterwards how to explain it.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to return the word to the prorector.
Thank you very much, Professor Peters, for your contribution. The next opponent is Professor Kunst. Professor Kunst is Professor of ENT Surgery at Maastricht University Medical Center and at Radboud University Medical Center in Nijmegen. Professor Kunst.
Thank you very much, Madam Pro-Rector. Dear candidate, I would like to congratulate you first with finishing the thesis. Very nice piece of work. For me as a clinician, quite some mathematics in it and physics. So as you may understand, I will focus mainly on the clinical area with respect to your thesis. First of all, I had a look at chapter 2, and what I was wondering, and I wrote this question down on page 40, you were describing there that you have various groups of causes of bilateral vestibular pathology. You can split it into 10 different groups, as you write. And I was wondering, you are doing the vestibular tests, so those are the physical tests with the hard figures that are coming out. But what's the place of history taking into this? And for example, and maybe you can also elaborate on that, would it be possible, for example, that you have 2 of the 10 various pathologies showing exactly the same bilateral vestibular pathology, but that would give rise to different kind of complaints and also maybe a different kind of advice regarding finally vestibular implantation?
Well, esteemed opponent, thank you for your question. Indeed, so in our study, we had a relatively big group of patients having bilateral vestibulopathy. But directly in our research, we did not take into account the history taking. So in our research, we tried to maybe classify the patients based on the outcomes of their reflex tests. And what we actually see that if we use only the outcomes of reflex tests, applying different mathematical methods, we can obtain only 2 groups of patients, the patients who performed really bad and the patients who performed not so bad. And together with that, we could not find any relation of the vestibular test outcomes with the etiology. So my opinion is that if we take into account only the vestibular reflex test outcomes, this information is not enough to maybe identify the underlying differences in the etiology groups. So if we have the pre-knowledge that this patient belongs to this etiology group, we can compare the tests between the groups. But if we, let's imagine we have only the test outcomes without any pre-knowledge about the etiologies, we could not classify them back. So probably in the future studies, we need maybe to extend our data set with an extra information about the patients, and probably we can get these small relations of the etiologies and the symptoms and the vestibular test outcomes.
Okay, thank you. And if you talk then about genetic disorders, of course you have DFNA9, the core gene, but on the other hand you have Usher syndrome, in which persons are also can become blind or are blind if you have a look at the congenital ones. And if you have a reflexia bilateral of the vestibular organ, does the visual function would give you a direction regarding this. So the specific subgroup of Usher, what's your opinion on that? If they have areflexia vestibular and also blindness?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your question. If I understand you well, the question is about if we have a group of patients with the genetic blindness, maybe if we can predict any vestibular deficits in such patients.
Yeah, and whether the visual impairment in Usher syndrome also does affect the algorithm of to what group they should be belonging, and whether or not finally, ultimately, advising vestibular implantation.
Yeah, thank you again for your question. I think at the moment it's really difficult to answer this question, but if we can maybe gather more data, especially genetic data from such patients, because even in our study, the genetic group is not the biggest etiology group. We can find the correlation between the vestibular deficits.
Okay, so then I would like to move on. Thank you for this answer. I would like to move on to another question, chapter 6, and that's about the rat model. I was wondering that if you are performing those tests in the rat, also I think that the vestibular perception testing, it's very interesting because I like right, it's also like the speech audiogram. So that's finally what it is all about. What's the perception of the patient? If you have this rat model, you don't have, you can have a look, of course, at the electrodes, how to position it. But would there also be a possibility in some kind of a way of perception, the vestibular perception testing in the rat? Have you been, so not only testing, you can measure electrical currents, testing position of the electrodes. You could also test areflexia or not. And would there also be a possibility of perception testing?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for a nice, interesting question. To my opinion, in theory, we can measure the motion perception of laboratory animals by, of course, placing the animal on the platform and placing some kind of animal analog of video oculography goggles on them. Because during the movement, we can also induce a vestibular ocular reflex. And by the vestibular ocular reflex, we can maybe find the relation between the reflex and the self-motion perception.
And maybe some conditioning, but that's not part of the thesis, of course. I could imagine in them, but that could be more biological testing. Then maybe also, because of the sake of time, the last one, what I was wondering in the rat studies, could you also, because now there are quite some patients implanted at the moment, making CT scans, deciding position of the electrode, then doing your measurements in those patients, would that now at the moment not be enough? Do you still need the rat model? Because now patients are implanted and you have now actually the human model.
Yes, highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your question. Of course, we have the humans implanted with the vestibular implant, but unfortunately in humans, we cannot study these electrical properties in the way we can do it in lab animals. In humans, the electrodes are already fixed and are already in place. And on top of that, we have the limitation of the software provided by the manufacturer. And I'm not sure that at the moment we can get the approval of medical ethics committee. We will come with a custom-made generator and the oscilloscope and ask if we can connect it to the real patient. Of course, the data that we can get from the humans is much more relevant, and we can construct, let's say, a personalized electrical conductivity models for each patient and try to see how much does it correlate with the reality. But anyway, I think that the knowledge about the electrophysiological parameters in the inner ear should be taken from the laboratory animal studies.
Yeah. Okay, well, I still have, now talking to you, still some question, but I pass on the word to the prorector. Thank you very much for your answers. Thank you very much.
Yes, I'd like to continue because we still have one opponent to go. The last opponent will be Dr. George. He is a medical physicist in audiology at Maastricht University Medical Center. Dr. George.
Thank you for this opportunity, Madam Prorector. Dear candidates, I'd like to congratulate you on this thesis. I was quite impressed because it not only presents work to optimize diagnostics, but also optimizing methods and does some suggestions to optimize rehabilitation. So in both methods and diagnostics and rehabilitation, so it's quite broad. So I was impressed by it, and it was my pleasure to read it. And congratulations on that. And of course, also my congratulations to your supervisory team. Some questions, though, of course. First, in chapter 2, you described various measures of outcomes and of vestibular impairments. However, the WHO, the World Health Organization, describes some sort of a model of health, and it shows not only impairments, but also health focuses on disabilities and participation. Can a patient participate in society? What is your opinion? Shouldn't outcomes in vestibular syndromes focus more on these disabilities and participation measurements?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for a question. This is indeed a good point. Since we performed our research, since the goal of our research was to find any patterns in the test outcomes, that's why we didn't include any, let's say, subjective or more or less subjective measures of those patients. But anyway, what I especially personally learned working with Professor Kingma is that one improvement of the objective measures is one side of the restoration of vestibular function. But if on top of that we can add to this subjective, also improvement of the some sort of subjective indicators, if the patient says, yes, for example, your tool or your device or your rehabilitation makes me feel better, this is also very important, and we should not forget about it.
Okay. Yeah, questionnaires might help to objectify these personal measures. But of course, that was not the subject of your thesis. You yourself, however, interestingly, do some suggestions to go from the impairments to a bit more functional measures. In chapter 4, for instance, at page 51, you say, okay, we do some motion detection. And you compare that with, it could be the comparison with speech audiometry. Why would this motion detector measure be comparable to speech audiometry? Could you elaborate on that?
It's a highly simple point. Thank you for the question. First of all, both in audiometry and measuring self-motion perception, we measure the thresholds. We measure the minimal quantity that the person in the first case can hear, and in the second case, the person can feel, that the person is moving.
I'm going to interrupt you a bit. Why did you not compare it with tone audiometry? Because tone audiometry really measures thresholds, but usually speech audiometry is some sort of more of a functional measure. So why is it more like speech audiometry and not like tone audiometry?
Thank you for the clarification. But I think we can do both. Actually, when measuring the self-motion perception, we can choose a single frequency motion and test the self-motion perception at that frequency that will be similar to the single tone audiometry. Or we can make our platform perform some kind of more, let's say, or more natural or movements, for example, like the person is walking or the person is driving a car, this will be more similar to the speech audiometry, when you have to perform some kind of functional actions during the test.
Indeed.
It is possible.
Yeah, I was quite surprised. You mentioned it somewhere that you did not perform any measures of real thresholds. There's always a person has to indicate whether he feels something and the motion. There were no measurements yet, am I right, concerning the real thresholds, right?
Yes, so there actually there exist a number of approaches how to identify the motion threshold, including like a yes/no paradigm, or like in our case that the person has to indicate the direction and the type of movement. So so we stick to this paradigm because this
Thank you.
Thank you for your answer. If you want to continue shortly.
Oh, yes. Sorry.
Finish your sentence.
Yeah. So we stick this paradigm because it reduces the chance of just random guessing and tricking the examiner.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for your contribution, Dr. George. Maksim Pleshkov, the time appointed for defending your thesis has passed. The degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and your defense. I request that you and your company await the results of our deliberations and our return. Okay, we're back. Maksim Pleshkov, the degree committee here present online has assessed the quality of your thesis and your defense. In view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Dr. van den Berg is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. I invite your supervisor to now take the floor.
Thank you. Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
Promise.
By the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present online, I hereby confer upon you, Maksim Pleshkov, the degree of doctor and grant you all the rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, you will soon receive the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the supervisor affixed with the official seal of the university shown by the beadle.
The laudatio will be given by Professor Demkin. Professor Demkin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Dear Chairman and a member of Assessment Committee, dear guests, before saying kind words for graduation of hero of this day, would like to remind you all that 10 years ago, on this day, a visit of the TSU, Tom State University delegation to the University of Maastricht took place, which marked the beginning of our further successful cooperation. In this regard, I want to emphasize the exclusive role of Professor Herman Kemper, with whom fate brought me together in development of cooperation between two universities and creation of scientific laboratory on the basis of Tom State University for modeling physical processes in biology and medicine, and creation of the joint education master program, physical methods and information technologies in biomedicine. It was these two key events that became the basis of creation scientific education environment for the trained specialists in the field of biomedicine at Tom State University and the training of high quality personnel in medical physics. The implementation of the master program began in 2015, and Maksim became one of the first students on this program, and after completing it, he entered to TSU graduate school. An important feature of our cooperation is the organization and scientific internship for undergraduate and graduate students at University of Maastricht. And for Maksim, this became decisive in implementation of his scientific interests in the field of medicine, and having a good fundamental background in physics at Tom State University, which he received in Tomsk, but combined with knowledge gained at University of Maastricht, Maksim did not hesitate to choose a scientific direction related to study of vestibular system. It must be said that Maksim's decision to move from Department of Plasma Physics to my department, Department of General and Experimental Physics, for participants in this program is not easy for him, because significant differences in curricula required additional study work, and knowledge of English language was are insufficient, but he overcome everything, and today's result confirmed his correct choice in the scientific path. I congratulate Maksim on a well-deserved victory and wish him a further straight passing the difficult but very interesting scientific world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Dear Dr. Pleshkov, also on behalf of the Board of Deans of Maastricht University, I'd like to congratulate you with the honor you have acquired. I also congratulate the supervising team, and I would like to thank the degree committee, especially our guests from outside, Professor Wuits and Professor van Bentum. We're very happy that you contributed to this PhD ceremony at Maastricht University. And Dr. Pleshkov, I wish you a lot of success with your further academic career, and maybe once there will be an opportunity to visit Maastricht again. With this, we come to an end, and I hereby declare this ceremony to be ended. So we